One Sunday, when Alex was visiting the Kemps, George excused himself to go and collect Harold from the Childers. They were always borrowing him, and he was always glad to go, not least to play with Brendan. Alex offered to go for the child, but George wouldn't hear of him breaking off the game of chess he was playing with Johanna. "Now finish your game," he insisted. "I'll be back in a minute." There was a long, expectant silence between the chess players. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked away. Johanna realized that this was the first time that she and Alex had been alone together. There had always been somebody around at the hospital, and Alex never visited them unless George was at home. She was aware of an entirely different atmosphere in the room. It had become emotionally charged and strangely intimate. It didn't seem wrong to her that this should be so. As Alex reached across the board to move a knight, he clumsily knocked over one of Johanna's castles. His hand rested close to hers. Without thinking, she gently covered his hand with her own. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They were at a loss to explain what had happened between them. Rising, Alex leaned across and gently kissed Johanna on the cheek. In doing so, he aroused her as George was no longer able to do. He satisfied an unfulfilled longing. They kissed again, this time much more passionately. Several chess pieces fell on the floor. An everlasting moment followed, interrupted finally by the voices of George and Harold in the drive. "I found him asleep with Brendan in the dog bed," George said as he came in, carrying the child. It surprised him to see the chess pieces lying on the carpet. He was silent for a moment. "Must have been a fierce game," he said. Johanna bowed her head. She blushed. "It was my fault." With one arm around Harold, who had run to her, she busied herself picking up the pieces. George had a fleeting recollection of his wife as he had seen her 5 years earlier, when she had come to Oxford for the boat race, with her pretty lace blouse and her straw hat with its large red ribbon. He remembered her smile when he had met her off the train, and recalled the look of joy in her eyes. Shortly afterwards, Alex stood up to go. On parting, he glanced at Johanna with a hesitancy that did not escape George. She felt the overwhelming grip of his fingers as he passed through the door. It left tremors. His footsteps grated on the gravel outside. That night, Johanna lay awake for hours. She was frightened and bewildered by what had happened. Nobody needed to tell her that man and wife were one flesh. The priest had done so at her wedding, and George and Harold were her life. She couldn't abandon herself to a passing infatuation for someone else. Her family must come first. But why had she become infatuated? Why had she taken Alex's hand? Was it because she needed somebody else to love, or because of a growing discontent with George? She didn't know. David Evans had once told her that there was a reason for everything, but there was no reason for this. It had just happened. All thought had been driven from her head. She wondered why such happiness had to occur almost accidentally, like a flash of lightning in a dark sky. Was God testing her? Torn between the heart's wishes and the impossibility of satisfying them, she finally fell into a troubled sleep. Alex never returned to the Kemps. George did not comment on his absence. He knew what had happened. He had taken it all in at a glance. "The truth dawned on me," he wrote in his diary, "when I saw the scattered chess pieces. I felt the excitement in the room. I saw it in Johanna's eyes. Alex's eyes confirmed my suspicions. At first, the possibility of their falling in love was so preposterous that my mind refused to accept it. Alex wouldn't do that to me, nor would Johanna. Perhaps I am imagining it. I've become so eaten up with my own worries and depression that I've forgotten to love the most wonderful companion that a man could have. My affections for her are always in my dreams, but they cannot be lived. Instead of being angry, I have a sense of guilt, of self-hate. I have no desire to inflict my secret remorse upon her. What has spoiled our happiness? Nothing, except that it is no longer shared, and not being shared, it is dead. It is not the big things that are driving me mad, but the little things, like the touch and warmth of Johanna's hand, or the tone of her voice. And what use am I? I can do nothing right. I always lose. It's as if I was meant to fail. Now I am about to lose my wife. I weep at the thought of it because I fear in my heart that she loves Alex more than me. As I cannot live without Johanna, what is the point of going on? Death fills my thoughts. Only death offers escape from my illusions. It frightens me. Jealousy grew in him daily. His spirit was clouded with his sense of failure. He recalled what Dostoevsky had written in The Brothers Karamazov, which he had read on his second visit to Cologne. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to such a pass that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and others. And having no respect, he ceases to love. Was he lying to himself about Johanna and Alex? No. If he were lying about Johanna's infidelity, then why was he so devastated by it? He had never felt so lonely. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" he asked Johanna one day. "About what?" She raised her eyebrows. "About your relationship with Alex. Don't you realize what you're doing? Have you no shame?" he shouted, giving way to anger. Johanna burst into tears and ran from the room. She knew in her heart that her love for Alex was too intense to last. George had the urge to tell Johanna how much he loved her. Instead, he went back to work, slamming the door behind him. A weariness possessed him. A week later, Alex appeared unexpectedly at the Radcliffe Infirmary. There was another outburst of feeling between Johanna and himself. "Can we go somewhere where we can talk?" he pleaded. Overwhelmed by his presence, Johanna begged to be let off duty for a couple of hours, and they drove to Blenheim Park a few miles away. It was a perfect April day, with the first flowers showing. After walking hand in hand, they sat in the shade under the trees. Being a weekday, the park was empty of visitors. Whatever Johanna and Alex may have intended when they left the Radcliffe, they gave way to their emotions once they were alone. They became insensible to everything except their passion for each other. It possessed them. With shafts of sunlight breaking through the trees, the two young lovers knew nothing but rapturous delight. Why is it, Johanna asked herself, that everything else fades in his presence? Why the magic? Why the longing? Why does his love flood my heart? Johanna was filled with shame that night. She had betrayed her husband and broken her marriage vows, so much so that she found herself unable to appeal for help to the Mother of Christ. Her love for Alex had come upon her like a storm of her own making, and she had lost her head. As if in a dream, she had given herself to him willingly. But how could she? It was adultery, the brink of damnation. She had never known such misery. She recalled a phrase from the Bible about tasting bitter ashes. That weekend, she went to confession. Her conscience weighed her down. "I shall refuse to give you absolution," the priest threatened, "if you see that man again. The lusts of the flesh have blinded you to the immortality of your soul. Go and sin no more." The consolation she sought was denied her. Alex had no peace either. Other than divorce, which Johanna refused to consider, there was only one way out. They would have to part. He hated living a lie behind George's back, hated seeing what he saw of himself in a mirror. The deceit had to end. To leave the country was the only decent thing to do. The next morning, he called an old friend in the War Office.